On this computer. It says recording, so we'll go. I'd like to start by introducing Maria Dahlberg. Maria is a program officer at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She focuses on policies and different programs and practices that help in creating inclusive environments for scientists, engineers, and healthcare professionals. She is here today to talk a lot about perhaps her own career path, or specifically how I learned, how I was introduced to Maria was through the National Academies report on the Science of Effective Mentorship in STEMM. That's STEM with 2 M's, so science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine. If you haven't checked out that report yet, I encourage you to spend some time with it. Among other things, this report has a lot of great resources for both mentors and mentees. With that, I will turn it over to you, Maria.
Sure. Hi, my name is Maria, yes, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Heather. I am going to let you guys know just straight off the bat that I have been suffering from some migraines for the first part of this week, so I haven't had an opportunity to actually prepare any specific remarks. I want to thank you all for submitting some questions in advance so that I can focus some of my conversation with you guys today. And I do really want it to be a conversation. So if you are able and willing to have your video on, that would be great. If you're not, I totally understand. Again, we are recording, so I get it. I also would love it if you guys think of questions on the fly. You can either turn your audio on and ask me a question or submit it through the chat box. I don't know whether that's enabled on this Zoom or not, and I'm happy to get them, or maybe if you have Heather's email, you can submit them directly to Heather and she can facilitate it that way. I really just want this to be sort of a general conversation about either how I got to my very odd position or what the science of mentorship says, particularly in this sort of weird space that we're in right now. And I saw in the questions that you guys submitted, there was a lot about sort of how do you maintain or engage or develop mentorship relationships? And so I kind of want to start there. And this is something that the report talks a fair amount about. In particular, a lot of the takeaway messages that I got. And I will say that the report itself, right, like, I'm a physicist by training. I don't have a lot of, or I didn't come into the process of writing this report with a fair, substantial amount of background knowledge myself, other than just my own mentorship experiences. And I think that's how most people approach mentorship, right? It's just like, this was what was done with me, so I'm going to mimic that, or this was done with me, so I'm going to do exactly the opposite. And what the Science of Mentorship report and what the research that backs it up really says is that those sort of ad hoc approaches aren't necessarily the way to go, and that there are some approaches that we can investigate and that you can implement as you're engaging in your mentorship, both as a mentor and as a mentee, to really help develop and sustain these relationships in very adequate and developmentally supportive ways. So the first aspect is, even before you're engaging in mentorship at all, you have to understand why you would like to have mentorship. What are those outcomes that you're interested in gaining from a relationship? What are the expectations that you have from that relationship? What are you hoping to develop to enhance in your career or provide to somebody else? So what's the like goal that you're trying to set? If you don't have a reason for it, it's going to be really hard to actually sort of project and engage further. Then you also have to figure out, what do you not want from the relationship? what are those boundaries? So setting the expectations is not just about like setting the high points and what are you willing to provide, but also like what is not there. And there are a whole bunch of things that go into mentorship, right? There's the career development aspects. There's guidance along, you know, have you thought about this? There's guidance along about how do you develop this particular skill set? There's role modeling. Are you looking for someone who can be something that you aspire to and you want to mimic them? Or are you looking to be that person for somebody? There's also psychosocial development and support mechanisms. So are you looking to be someone who can actually provide guidance when something is going really horribly, or celebration with somebody? There are all of these different facets that come together. And if you're only doing celebration and like support, that's actually more friendship. And if you're only doing like career guidance lines, that's advising. These are really important, but they aren't mentorship. Mentorship is actually this sort of holistic support mechanisms that have both career support and psychosocial support. And knowing how much of what functions you can provide or how much of what functions you are seeking out as a mentee is really important as you are approaching other people in your mentorship. It's also really important to think about the fact that you're probably not looking for one person, right? That one special person who can provide you with that best career advice and can be that perfect role model and can provide you with that psychosocial support that will just give you that shoulder to cry on and that perfect glass of wine when you need to celebrate. That person doesn't really exist. And if they do, everybody is leaning on them already. So they're probably overworked. What you're probably looking for is a conglomeration of different people who can give you that full support mechanism. It also, from the flip side, means that you are probably not going to provide all of those functions to any given person, but you might provide those functions in different levels to different people at different times and in different ways. It could be that you provide all of those functions to one person over a course of a relationship. Which also gives me to sort of another stage. Mentorship comes in stages. Some seminal work by Kathy Cram, I'm sorry I hate that word, but I used it anyway. Some initial work, groundbreaking work by Kathy Cram in the 1980s actually laid out 4 stages of mentorship. And these have been developed by different people at different times, but they often kind of collapse back down to these 4 stages. Initiation, cultivation, separation, and redefinition. The first 2 people have generally pretty good time with. Initiation is finding somebody. It could be running into somebody sort of in the street or at a conference or in your classroom or wherever you end up finding somebody who you just click with and things work out really well. It could be that you sign up for a mentorship program and you get assigned somebody, and that initiation part. There's this period of building rapport and feeling out trust and figuring out who those other people are in the relationship and how they're going to interact with you, figuring out where your expectations align, where they don't align, how you're going to bridge those gaps, who else needs to be in this relationship, how all those pieces work together. Cultivation is where the actual work is getting done. You're developing those skills, you're giving those support, you're asking those questions, you're challenging, you're developing each other in different ways, and you're giving back and forth and back and forth. You're still building trust, you're still building rapport, there's challenges that's going on, there's lots of active listening, there's lots of all of these different aspects that you just have to figure out, and you have to have a lot of good conversations and lots of self-reflection going on. separation is one that people get a little scared of, particularly because of that name, right? Like it seems like a really scary thing to think about separation, but what it actually looks like in practice is a recognition that whatever original functions, whatever those expectations, those goals of that mentorship process that you were engaging with, the reason for that original relationship, they've been met. That the mentees that are involved are somehow pulling away. They no longer need the supports that they originally needed. And that's where you get to the redefinition. You have to take a moment, you have to recognize that maybe at this point, we need to redefine what our relationship is. Maybe that means we need to set new expectations and the mentorship can develop again. And you do go back to cultivation and you do some more ideas and you develop and you engage and then you separate again and you can redefine. That's a possibility and you can have continuation. Or it could be that you become colleagues. Or it could be that you become friends. Or it could be that that relationship is done and you no longer need to have that connection point anymore because that's no longer a necessary part of either one of yours function. That's not a bad thing. That means it serves its purpose and it's done its correct part of your life. It's a good thing. But that's not something that our society is very good at handling. So I've covered a lot that's in there. I covered stages of mentorship. I actually covered the definition of mentorship. I covered support mechanisms of mentorship. I covered setting expectations, developing trust, setting rapport. I covered a bunch of other stuff, but there are tools that are in there that you can use to help guide this. You can develop yourself a mentoring plan. This is how I generally approach my mentorship. Does it fit with other people? You can use stuff like IDPs, individual development plans, that allow you to map up, these are my general goals. And that allows you to identify what kind of structures you might need to put around you. Mentoring maps help you identify who is in your mentoring spheres, what kind of mentorship you already have, and maybe where are the gaps in that mentorship that helps you identify who you might need. And then there are mentoring compacts or mentoring agreements. And those are items which allow you to have conversations between mentors and mentees that lay out what those expectations were at the beginning and allow you to come back to them over the course of a mentoring relationship and check in and say, do they still work? Are we still aligned with what we want? Do they need to be updated? Do we need to redefine? Have we met what we need to do? Are we done? I think that's my basic spiel about mentorship in like 10 minutes. And I really would love to hear questions and have conversations. So I'm going to take a drink of water.
That's fantastic, Maria. Thank you. Y'all should feel free to unmute, turn your video on, whatever you're comfortable with. You can type your questions in the chat and we can facilitate some dialogue that way. To get us started, you mentioned that separation redefinition, those stages of mentorship are often the most challenging. And I've talked with a lot of people and some of the questions reflect this, that sometimes you want to separate a mentoring relationship because it's just not working for you. Like you haven't accomplished your goals. So what is the right strategy? Try to redefine the relationship before you completely separate, or like what would be the strategy there? When does the evidence tell us that it's better just to fully separate the relationship without trying to continue to redefine?
So I don't think there's a hard and fast line about when do you do what. I think it needs to be done on an individual relationship basis. Now, I will also point out that some of what you're talking about deals with negative mentoring experiences. And that's actually one of the areas of research that is probably the least studied, unfortunately. We found less information in that sort of general regime, particularly in the STEM research in STEM areas. There's some from the business literature as well. But I will say that one way that you can help prevent negative mentoring experiences is through clearly at the beginning seeing if your expectations align. And that involves potentially hard conversations, right? You might really want to work with somebody, or really, particularly in research environments, which again is the focus of the report, undergraduate and graduate post-secondary education. So in STEM, right? So a lot of these are research-based relationships. You might find somebody who your research, you're like, I really want to work with this person, but your mentorship needs don't align with their mentorship provisions, right? They just won't be able to provide you with what you need in terms of the mentorship.
Right.
Now, you have to make a choice about whether the research that you want to do will make up, you're willing to sacrifice some of that mentorship directly and seek it elsewhere. So you'll have to find your mentorship from somebody else. And that's fine, but just be aware that you're now going to be going to other different sources, multiple sources, and you cannot expect from that person to provide something that they don't want to give you. You also, right, like those sorts of conversations though need to be explicit. You can't just assume either that they're going to give you something that you want because you want it and because somebody in the past gave it to you who served a similar role or otherwise. You also can't expect that they're not going to give it to you just because you didn't ask for it, right? So you have to put yourself out there. There's an element of vulnerability. And I will put this very blatantly. The people who have the most power in the relationships are probably going to be the mentors. Not always, but like 99% of the time. Not a statistics that's in the literature, guys. That was me making it up. The mentors are going to have the power. So they need to take on those vulnerable roles as much as possible. They cannot expect their mentees to make themselves vulnerable in order to match them. They cannot expect their mentees to alter their expectations to match them. That's inappropriate, ineffective. It requires emotional labor and emotional work and just detrimental effects on the mentees if they are constraining their identities to match the mentees' expectations, mentors' expectations, excuse me. The mentors have to be able to be the ones who put themselves out there. That's how you're going to develop that trust and the rapport. They also, even if they put themselves out there and make themselves vulnerable, they can't expect their mentees to reciprocate. They might not. That's like saying, I gave you a cookie, now you give me a cookie, because that's how it works. That's not how it works.
So we're talking a lot about like teams for developing your mentoring team, and Donna has added to the chat that the NIH definition of mentor on a K grant has evolved a great deal in recent years to include mentoring team, and reviewers expect team members to have communicated and understand their own role as part of the team. You mentioned the mentor map as a way for, as an individual, I can assess my mentoring team. Can you say a little more about that, how that works in the research environment?
Yeah, so one, I'm really glad you brought up the mentoring, the KA grants. I think that's a really great and explicit example of multiple mentorship. It's one of the only ones that we could really highlight, not the only, but I think one of the really clear ones of where it is expected in a research environment. It's not only expected, it's actually required of a lot of the KA grants, right? You are required to say, this person will provide this person will provide this person will provide this, and this person, and lay it out. I don't know, I was aware that they all are actually expected to communicate across, which is great. I think that's a lovely way of doing it, and I think that's actually really important. That way you don't get a whole slew of mixed messages, and Donna's actually going to contribute. Yes?
I'm trying to hold myself back because this is your show.
Yeah, please. I want this to be conversation.
But I have this tendency to jump in because I spent many years as a program officer, and I was in charge of training and career development for my branch. So I saw a lot of these, and even though I am not in that job anymore, I keep up and contribute. And this is definitely happening. It's one of those things they don't tell you about the review process, but they do. They will give you a better score on mentoring if it is clear that the members of the team understand what each other are supposed to be doing as members of that team, and they mention it in their bio sketch statement that they have talked to doctors A, B, and C, and they know that they're going to be doing this and I'm going to be doing this. Reviewers love that. So I think that speaks very much to your point earlier about the need for harmony or consensus and understanding among the mentoring teams rather than working at cross purposes.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and I'm very happy to hear that, although, as you mentioned, it's not explicitly stated anywhere, which is probably why we didn't find it. So yeah, it's having, so I think your question, Heather, was about how do you use these mentoring maps? And so one way is to just lay this out, to
Just
identify
write it all down.
what your potential needs are, right? I have a goal. I would like to learn how to play the flute. I don't actually, but that's a goal. So I would like to find somebody who already knows the flute, who can be a role model for me, and find somebody who is currently learning how to play the flute, who can be a peer with me going through the process, and we can gripe about how difficult it is to spit rice. I've heard that's a thing that you have to do.
Yeah. As a person who played the flute in middle school, that the shape your mouth must make to make noise on the flute is, I mean, it's roughly what it takes to spit a grain of rice.
I've been told. Apparently, I was not told in error.
Nope.
I need to find somebody who can actually teach me how to play the flute. That might be the same person who's the role model, but it might not.
Okay.
And I probably want to find somebody who is a little bit above me in playing the flute, who I'm not scared of like making mistakes in front of, but who could still correct me.
Yeah.
And I might even want to find somebody who's below me in playing the flute, who I could help teach, because that's also a great way, right? So I've now identified 5 people in my mentoring map.
Yeah.
I need to identify who those people are.
That's excellent, actually, because a lot of, for the AWIS DC chapter in particular, I've noticed a lot of people are either considering or fully in trying to transition their career from a academic kind of lab setting to something else. And so that's learning a new instrument is actually a really useful analogy for people who are trying to do something like that.
Yeah, it's also one I should, again, to be very explicit about this. the last time I tried to learn a new instrument, I was 5 and I was playing the piano, so that's maybe a poorly constructed analogy. But yeah, right, like there are a number of different roles that I can sort of pull out of my very curly fluff and make roles for who I would like to identify and how they might overlap or might not.
Yeah.
But I could try and seek people out and ask them if they would be willing to play that role with me. And then what would I be able to provide to them in terms of that relationship? And what would I expect from them in terms of that relationship? And maybe even how long would I expect that relationship to last?
All right. So in general, like as we're each constructing and filling in our mentorship map and our team, people who's going to mentor us, how do you deal with the rejection of that? I know my personal strategy is to not treat it as a personal slight, that there are any number of reasons why someone doesn't want to be my mentor that have nothing to do with me. But what are your thoughts on that?
So one, congratulations. That is very big of you, and nearly impossible for most people. I mean, I say that as pure human, right? Like it is very difficult when you ask somebody to have some sort of give and take relationship and they say no. What I try and do is remind myself that if they've told me no and I try and pursue it anyway, it's gonna turn out badly. It's gonna be bad for me, it's gonna be bad for them, and it's gonna be detrimental in the end. And that doesn't make it hurt less, right? Like I still wanted to get something out of that relationship with them. But in the end, it was gonna be horrible.
Right. Like if they had said yes and couldn't actually give me what I wanted, that would be worse almost than that initial ripping the Band-Aid off of just no.
Yeah, right. They would have overpromised. What I can do and what they might be able to do, right, is figure out a lesser ask.
Yeah.
And that lesser ask could
recommend
be,
someone
could we do a coffee every 6 months? Would you be willing to introduce me to somebody else who you think could serve that role? Do you have anybody else in your social circle? Do you have a paper I could read? Right? There are a number of far lesser asks that you might be able to get. And if they still say no, then you really didn't want to be engaged with that person because they would have given you nothing. And you would just be trailing behind them. Which means, right, like, nonetheless, if that person is a superstar and you want to track them, then they can be a role model. They might not be a role model that you want to fully emulate because they just turned you down for like 7 things, but they can still be a role model for something.
That's great.
But yeah, right, like rejection is a tough one.
Always tough, yeah.
And it is difficult to have.
Yeah. So we've made it this far, 32 minutes through this webinar without directly talking about coronavirus and COVID-19, but
yes!
I feel like that's an accomplishment that we should applaud ourselves for. Yay, but that's the max. We've made it. We are, I now have a question related to that. Specifically, like how does engaging in mentorship relationships have to change when it can't happen in person? Now that we're all mostly virtual, are there actually upsides because now we can more easily justify a mentoring relationship that doesn't rely on in-person? So like I here in the Washington, D.C. metro area could ask for mentorship from somebody in Sacramento, California, because we're virtual. What are your thoughts on all that?
So I think that there are a number of things that will not change. There are a number of things that probably will, which is the most non-answer I could possibly give you. I think that one, it's important to try and maintain the existing mentoring relationships that you have, if everybody sort of agrees and can do that. I think it's important to respect and engage and touch base. I think in the same way that hopefully people are doing so with their friends and their family, check in, figure out if you had a regularly scheduled meeting with your mentors, try and keep that up, because that's going to be important. And yeah, do it over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever platform is most convenient for you. You might have to change what the focus of conversation is. You might have to go through a re-evaluation, or have another explicit conversation about what does this mean for us. If you guys only had a relationship that focused on one specific, very in-person thing, somebody was helping you with your volleyball spike, all right, figure out what that means, and whether that means, for right now, we're going to go on hold, or I'm going to teach you a couple of techniques and then you're going to go practice them. Who knows? I think there are ways to keep it up. In terms of how are things going to change? Yeah, I think you're right. The circle of people who you can engage with, if you were only thinking about people who were going to be in your immediate geographic location before, has now expanded. I think that wasn't the case. I think that there are a number of weeks, I don't think this, I know that there were a number of people who were already engaging with folks across the country and around the world. There are Twitter handles that act like giant mentorship circles. There are national and international conferences that are based basically on structured mentorship systems. So, and then there are mentorship programs that are originally founded and based only online already. So those already exist, and I think that they are going to be as, if not more important now. I think in particular for underrepresented groups, for a pandemic like this that is stressing and exacerbating and highlighting the disparities in our healthcare system, I think it's going to be super important to make sure that our mentorship structures that were in place to help develop the inclusion and belonging in our science, the development of our young scientists, that's going to be really important to keep those systems going. And anybody who's involved in those should make sure that they are continued. I know that there are programs out there where former mentors and mentees have now reconnected because they're looking for that, particularly the psychosocial support that they had previously, they ended, and now they're developing again.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You mentioned some mentoring circle Twitter handles and resources and things like that. Any off the top of your head that you can list off that we can go look up later?
Sure. So the ones that come to mind and the ones that we highlighted in the report were ones like Vanguard STEM,
yes,
Black in STEM, Diverse Double Docs. These would be the three that I can think of right offhand.
That's great.
But yeah.
Yeah. So someone else has asked, Jackie has asked a question. A lot of what we're talking about sounds to me, at least, like it doesn't have to exist within a structured program or organization. You can kind of create this for yourself. Am I getting the right sense there?
Yes. I think that a lot of the findings and the recommendations and the systems that we're talking about are not exclusive to formal mentorship. So I think what you're talking about is formal mentorship. It's also not exclusive to informal mentorship. And one of the things that's interesting about what happens in particular in research settings, say for graduate research programs, and even in undergraduate research, a lot of what that is neither formal nor informal. It sort of lies in this intersection between, defining my terms. Formal mentorship is something that happens in a very structured program. You are matched normally one-to-one with another individual through some sort of algorithm or other matching program. It has a fixed term often. You have some sort of set number of meeting dates, not necessarily, but it is run by an outside group. Informal is you bump into somebody or you otherwise meet somebody and you set up a sort of mentoring relationship, and it sort of evolves organically. It often has less of a fixed term and it sort of terminates as it terminates. The reason why we put research mentorship in sort of this ambiguous space in between is most cases are not necessarily assigned to your research mentor or research advisor, hopefully if they become a mentor. You may or may not have a fixed term of that appointment. Sometimes they have a supervisory role, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have other people involved, sometimes you don't, right? Like there's sort of this ambiguity between what is going on in that research space. So in terms of the general concepts that we're talking about, they're not specific to one setting or the other. The only things that are really special about one or the other is that like outside matching really occurs in formal settings often.
Okay.
But reading Jackie's question here, it is Jackie, yeah. About how do you find people outside of formal settings? Go to places where you think those people will be. It's, I mean, kind of scary, but yeah, there's not generally like match.com for informal mentoring, I don't think.
Perhaps there's a market. Brianna, I think you have some questions to ask.
I do, so thank you. I apologize for having my video off before. I've been making my son lunch during the beginning part of this, but I really wanted to join in. So I am currently the co-chair of a women's mentoring network, which is part of a professional society, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. And I've been on the steering committee for the mentoring network for a couple of years, and we rotate chairs every year. Although I think I'm going to stay on for another year. And so my questions are about, we've tried to develop kind of, well, I guess, formal mentoring circles, and I wasn't involved in the development of that. And so apparently the steering committees, so I should mention this is specifically for like graduate students, early career and above, so not including undergraduates in physical anthropology. So as the mentoring circles were developed, apparently there was a vote to basically make them sort of egalitarian, so that nobody was going to be in charge, and nobody would, I guess, maybe have the pressure of having to lead a circle. And when you fill out the form to sign up for one of these mentoring circles, you're asked there's a variety of topics, and basically one of the questions is, which of these topics are you interested in receiving mentoring on, and which could you provide mentoring on? So I guess my two questions are, given that we're doing sort of topical based mentoring, that I think the topics we've talked about, like maybe we should alter them right now in the time of coronavirus. But given that we've structured this in a sense around topics, and some topics have 50 people and some topics have 8 people, and there hasn't been a mechanism by which anyone is really encouraged to kind of reach out and launch a mentoring circle. And what does it mean to launch a mentoring circle? And you know, it's, in a sense, it's unclear about like, what do you do if, sorry about that. Of course, I got a phone call in the middle of that. Like, you know, how do you, like maybe because everybody who's involved can see the list of people's names and emails, you know, it's also a little bit of a resource of like, I really have a, you know, question about work-life balance. Here's a list of people I can reach out to. But I guess, does anyone have recommendations about how to encourage within, you know, we may need to revote about the sort of totally egalitarian structure, because my particular views, it doesn't seem to be working within kind of a formal mentoring circle. But how can we encourage people to reach out, and what should a mentoring circle look like in that kind of situation?
So I don't know if I will put this out that like we didn't really address this in the report. So this is me speaking, not Maria, the representative of the National Academies speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like even though you don't want to have a leader or somebody who has like the responsibility to take ownership of any of these circles, which I understand because that can give somebody feel like they're sort of puppeteering. It might be useful to bring somebody in who can serve as a facilitator.
Okay. I mean, yeah, my personal feeling, honestly, is that we have to have some kind of leadership among these circles. Otherwise, nobody takes ownership for even facilitating, like, hey, we're all going to get on a Zoom call in this day and at this day and time.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, like, if you've ever encountered this like leaderless structure for a mentorship circle, and does it work? Because part of what I wanted to come back from this conversation is report back to my group and be like, hey, here's some expert advice. Either A, this is not going to work the way that we've set it up, or B, oh, here's something we haven't thought about.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm reflecting on this actually from my perspective as staff on the National Academies. And that often what we do is we bring together a group who is highly interested in a particular topic. And then we as staff actually serve as outside facilitators. We're not particularly, we're interested in the topic, but we're not the experts on the topic. We brought the experts together, and what we're serving as is the facilitator, right? We are helping guide their conversation. So we plant a seed of a question and have them respond to it. We make sure that they meet once every 3 weeks or something, right? We give them a structure in which they can function.
Okay.
Because they need to have a structure in which to function.
Yeah.
Amorphous blobs will blob.
That's pretty much what's happening. So that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
That doesn't mean that the facilitator has to be a member of the group. It could be, but that puts onus on that person to serve in a role that is actually external to the circle, and they might not feel like they can engage. So you might want to find somebody who is not part of that.
Oh, interesting.
To be that facilitator. And that might be a bit of an onus. It might fall on you as a chair to say, we would like to, here's a set of 5 questions that all mentorship circles should answer, and just start that conversation and see where that takes it.
Would you recommend looking at the report to find those sorts of questions? Or do you think it's, if we're doing topic specific, those are questions that we can generate amongst ourselves?
I don't know. I don't think we have a lot of like specific questions in that sense within the report. I think they could be as general as, you know, what do you hope to get out of this?
Yeah, that's a good, okay. Yeah.
Why did you agree to join this circle?
Okay.
And then they, you know, are you looking to connect, you know, 50 people is a large group to have a facilitated conversation with?
Yeah.
8 seems fairly reasonable to me, it turns out.
Okay.
You can make some substantial connections with 8 people.
Yep.
And going back to sort of one of the fundamental elements of mentorship, you want to be able to build trust.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to be able to feel like I can open up to anybody within that circle
Mm-hmm.
and feel safe about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible to do that with 50 people, but that will take a lot of time.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality is that because it's an international organization, just like the practicality of time differences means that probably not everyone who signed up for I want mentoring on, like, you know, going up for tenure is going to get, you know, is going to be available at the same time. So I think in some of those larger groups, there will be some natural fragmentation.
Yeah, I would also suggest, you know, I don't know if, I'm not going to put any of the leaders of like the large hashtag groups out there on the spot, but those would be the sorts of people who, right, like they built those communities very intentionally,
Deliberately, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it takes time, and they built communities of trust because they all had a particular identity and a particular set of structure issues and ideas that they were working towards and around. So when you entered and engaged with that hashtag, you knew who else was engaging and working with that hashtag.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you.
The only other thing that I would think of is if you can find a way to have everybody who's within a particular mentorship circle agree to a set of guidelines for that circle.
Okay. Yep.
And I mean, in that sense, develop those guidelines.
Yep. Okay. I mean, and you know, it's interesting because of the nature of some of the topics, we assume that through time, people will move in and out of particular circles as like, they're really, you know, they're on the job market and looking for advice about that. And then they're not, but they might be willing to, you know, mentor about that. So that's the other kind of, you know, interesting thing about this is there may be fluid membership, which is, so that makes like getting to know you and trust and stuff a little bit more difficult in a sense.
Yeah, that can be hard.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
It's 12:50. What other questions do people have? Any other topics? Laurel?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask, you know, what seems like kind of an obvious question amidst this pandemic. What do we know about best practices for mentoring at a distance? And, you know, especially when this comes more to the, you know, faculty student mentoring.
I'm gonna go with not as much as we would like.
Okay, so we're figuring this out.
Yeah, so context matters for a lot of things.
Yeah.
I think context in this case is a lot more about what you're trying to accomplish. What are your expectations? Mentoring at a distance is going to be similar to a lot of things at a distance, a lot of the social interactions that you're having at a distance. Mentorship is inherently a social relationship. And so many of those same factors that you have to take into account when you are engaging or transitioning a social relationship, you will have to take into account when you're engaging and transitioning a mentorship relationship into a social distance. You have to be consistent with the way that you are communicating. You have to be aware that tone does not come across in text. You have to be clear about not making assumptions and be very explicit about asking the questions.
Mhm.
You have to make sure that you are not assuming that your state of mind is their state of mind. These are all very difficult for humans.
Mhm.
Humans are not very good at these things. We're really good at assuming that what I'm going through is what you're going through. And that is not the case for any of us, even if we have nearly identical situations.
Mhm.
None of that is backed by the research in the report. That is
Well, right, because
purely
we
my
had,
personal experience right now.
well, we haven't had a pandemic in a while, so you know it's good that we're having one to learn about it.
Yeah, and I will say that we're doing ongoing, I mean, this feels very weird to say, and I will make sure that everybody understands the context in which it's being said, but this is probably one of the more dynamic and exciting and relevant periods for my personal professional life, in that I work in higher education policy and workforce development. And right now, the entirety of my professional focus is going through potentially the only experimental phase that it will ever go through. It is weird, and we are doing a lot, and we are trying really hard not to mess it up.
Yeah. Charlie's asked a question that, correct me if I'm summarizing this incorrectly, but I think it gets to the question of platforms for identifying and connecting with mentors. Sounds like the job environment isn't necessarily encouraging of collaboration, and so which would make it difficult to find a mentor in a work setting. Is LinkedIn a good way to do that? What are some of the other platforms?
I've never tried to connect on LinkedIn. I have seen people
Donna is incredibly surprised at this announcement.
I that's just my own personal experience. I'm very limited on LinkedIn. I have seen people connect successfully on Twitter. To do so, you know, be aware and be careful about who you're connecting with, but I feel like it is very possible, and there is really great connections that can be made. I will also say, if we were in different times and potentially done so in the correct way now, at conferences, professional conferences are a fantastic way of making connections. That, you know, you can go out, and there are now virtual poster sessions that are great, and finding people who are interested in similar areas or very dissimilar areas that are intriguing to you, and making connections that way. I feel like in that sense, LinkedIn is a possibility. Again, I'm not good at working that system, so I can't make that appropriate recommendation. But yeah, I think social media is a great place to do it.
Yeah, something that I've often been told about LinkedIn is that it is in fact a great way to identify and make these sorts of connections. And there are a couple of different strategies that people have shared with me of either finding that person that you want to get connected to but aren't, and seeing who you know in common and ask for that person to make the introduction. And then it's also, I've had people reach out to me directly despite having no introduction, no intermediary. And in the little note, when you click connect with someone on LinkedIn, you can and should write a note explaining why you want to connect with that person. And that's kind of the 0th stage of establishing any sort of mentoring relationship. You make that connection, and then you do the follow-up, or that's the initiation, and then you move into your cultivation and really building that out.
I will say that the initiation is not just that first point of contact.
Okay, good clarification.
Initiation should also involve like setting the expectations.
Yes.
There's a bit of back and forth involved, but yes, I
It is the
will
zero
second
step
the like
initiation.
making sure you put a note in LinkedIn. I've gotten several messages from people where people are just like, I know you, and I'm like, I don't remember who you are.
And I think the reason LinkedIn is a focus network for this is because people expect professional relationships on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
whereas the other more social networks, from my experience, unless you have specifically cultivated your Twitter account to be your professional presence, might be, some people draw clear lines between professional presence and their personal presence.
And Charlie, I do just want to note that your comment about conferences is directly correct. This idea that a lot of people are paying for their own way towards conferences, and this spring, because a lot of conferences got switched over to virtual, there was actually a really big rise in conference attendance, which was fantastic because people didn't have to pay their own way. They could just attend. And you could watch different people's talks at different times. There was a lot less trying to bounce back and forth between different sessions. So it is also a way to scope out people who you may have heard a little bit about and may not actually know all that much about now. So learning a little bit more about them, including when you then go and connect with them on LinkedIn, you can now talk a little bit about the research that they're doing or their discussions that they're having. And that is also really useful whenever you're cold emailing or cold LinkedIning. That's not a verb, but it should be.
We'll make it a verb. We're coming on the end of our hour. Eddie has included a question about mentoring as a leader development activity, and sounds like the challenge is getting buy-in from the membership that should be considered a leadership development activity. What are your tips on how to shift that mindset?
So I don't know what the specifics, goals, or mission statement of your organization are, but generally speaking, mentorship has a lot of really fantastic outcomes that most organizations are really interested in, including aspects like making sure that your young professionals stay in the field and feel included in their development and develop a sense of their own professional identity and can control what they're doing, can have more productive professional outcomes. Figure out what the outcome that your organization will probably be interested in, and they'll probably be willing to engage in it. A lot of the ones that people in the academic sphere are really interested in involve stuff like mentorship takes a lot of time and it's a lot of money and it's a lot of effort. And it turns out that if you do mentorship right, it actually takes less time and effort because you're doing it correctly instead of having to go back and do it over and over and over again. So if you're setting up an effective mentorship relationship from the beginning, you will actually have better outcomes and better relationships and happier individuals involved and more individuals involved and more diverse individuals involved and a more inclusive and engaged set of people who are doing the work that you want them to be doing. I can go on and on and on if you would like me to, but there are a lot of great things. By the way, I do want to put out there, mentorship is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all your problems. You still have to do a lot of other work, but there's a lot there.
I actually think that's a really good note to end the webinar on, unless you have any final comments you want to wrap us up with.
No, I'm happy to end with mentorship is not a panacea. I think that's
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for lunch and this chat, Maria, and everybody for tuning in as well. I'm going to stop this recording.